She leaned across the cold metal table, her hands trembling as they reached for his. The prison visiting room buzzed with the sound of murmured conversations, guards shifting in place, and the faint clink of vending machine snacks being unwrapped. To everyone watching, it looked like a tender moment between a husband and wife, a rare chance to bridge the distance that concrete walls had forced between them. But then, her lips brushed his ear. She whispered just 7 words, words that would detonate every ounce of love left in his heart. His face went blank. His grip tightened. And before anyone could stop him, the man who had once vowed to protect her was standing, his chair scraping against the floor. His eyes locked on hers with a rage no one in that room could ever forget. In less than a minute, the visiting room would become a crime scene. What you're about to hear is not just a story about betrayal. It's a story about how one secret, spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time, can shatter lives forever. It's about a man already trapped behind bars who thought the worst had already happened, until he found out that the woman he loved was sleeping with someone from his past, an ex-convict he once called a friend. I want you to stay with me until the very end, because every twist in this case will pull you deeper into the emotions, the lies, and the choices that led to that final, irreversible moment. If you love stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss one. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I'd love to know how far this story is traveling. Now, let's go back to the very beginning, before the visiting room turned deadly. Before the chaos, before the headlines, there was just Michael and Renee. Michael Torres wasn't a man you'd easily forget. At 34, his build still carried the kind of strength that came from years of hard labor, first in construction, then in the prison yard. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where trouble wasn't something you looked for, it was something that found you. Renee, on the other hand, was the kind of woman people noticed when she walked into a room. Not because she was loud, but because she had this quiet confidence, a warmth that made you believe she truly cared. She had been with Michael since they were teenagers. Back then, it was them against the world, sharing cheap takeout dinners on the hood of his car, planning a future that was more about dreams than reality. Their love was tested early. Michael got caught up in a robbery gone wrong, the kind of mistake that comes from desperation and bad advice. He claimed he was just a lookout, but the law didn't care. At 26, he was sentenced to a decade in prison. Renee promised to stand by him. And at first she did. Letters every week, visits every month, phone calls where they'd talk about everything and nothing just to feel close again. Inside, Michael did what he could to survive. He wasn't a saint. Prison changes you. He kept his circle small, and one of the few people he trusted was another inmate named Daryl. They worked in the kitchen together, traded commissary items, and even had each other's backs when tensions ran high. What Michael didn't know back then was that Daryl's story would one day collide with his in the worst possible way. When Daryl was released after serving his time, Michael wished him well. They lost touch, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that on the outside, Daryl's path and Renee's would eventually cross, and not by accident. By the time Michael had been inside for 6 years, Renee's visits had started to change. She still smiled when she walked in, but there was something else in her eyes, a shadow of distance. The phone calls felt shorter. The letters came less often. Michael told himself she was just tired, maybe stressed from work, maybe dealing with life on her own. But deep down, he felt something shifting. Still in his mind, Renee was his anchor. The thought of her waiting for him was what kept him from losing himself completely behind those walls. He had no idea that outside those gates, a different kind of story was unfolding, one that would make betrayal feel like a knife to the chest. It started small, the kind of changes most people would ignore. Renee used to answer Michael's calls on the first ring. Now sometimes it went to voicemail, and she'd call back hours later with a quick excuse. She used to talk about how she couldn't wait for the next visit. Now she skipped months saying money was tight or work shifts had changed. Michael tried to be understanding. Prison teaches you patience whether you want it or not. But when the visits did happen, he noticed the way she sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes drifting toward the clock. Conversations that once felt endless now seemed rushed. One day during a visit, Michael caught her checking her phone more than once. Phones aren't allowed inside the visiting room for inmates, but guests can keep them in their bags. Renee never used to touch hers during their time together. That day, she excused herself to the vending machine area, and when she came back, her mood seemed lighter. Michael didn't press her about it. He knew from experience that asking too many questions could make someone defensive. But the seed of doubt had been planted. In the weeks that followed, that seed grew roots. Then came the letter, or rather, the lack of one. For years, Renee had never gone more than 2 weeks without writing to him. This time, a full month passed in silence. When she finally did send a letter, it was short, almost cold. She wrote about bills, her car needing repairs, and how tired she'd been lately. But not once did she say she missed him. Michael read those words over and over, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. But prison is a place where small details mean everything. A shift in tone, a change in habits, a missing "I love you." These things don't happen without a reason. Then, one night during a phone call, Renee mentioned a friend who had been helping her fix things around the house. She said his name so quickly Michael almost missed it. But when it hit his ears, it froze him in place. Daryl. The same Daryl who once worked shoulder to shoulder with him in the prison kitchen. The same man he'd shared meals and secrets with. The same man he thought had walked away from the prison gates to start fresh, far away from anything connected to his old life. Michael's voice went still. He didn't accuse her. Not yet. But the tension in that moment was heavy enough to make Renee stumble over her words. She changed the subject quickly, laughing it off. But Michael wasn't laughing. In his mind, the pieces were already starting to move into place, and they formed a picture he didn't want to see. Michael couldn't shake the name. It echoed in his head every night as he lay on the thin prison mattress staring at the ceiling. Daryl, the man he'd once trusted with his back in the yard, now spending time with his wife. He told himself it could be innocent. Maybe Daryl really was just helping her with repairs. But that hope lasted only until his next phone call with Renee. She sounded distracted, almost distant. And when Michael casually asked if Daryl was still helping out, she hesitated. It was the kind of hesitation you can hear even through a static-filled prison line. Weeks passed, and the unease in Michael's gut grew heavier. Then, during another call, Renee slipped. She mentioned going to a barbecue with some friends. When Michael asked who was there, she named a few people, and then Daryl. She quickly tried to move past it, but Michael's mind locked onto the image, his wife and his old cellmate, laughing together at a backyard party while he sat in a concrete cell. The confirmation came in a way he hadn't expected. One of the prison guards, a man who occasionally passed him newspapers or bits of gossip, leaned over during count one evening and said, "Hey Torres, small world. Guess who I saw on the outside the other day? With your wife." Michael's chest tightened. He didn't want to hear it, but the guard went on. Daryl. Looked like they were more than friends, if you know what I mean. That night, Michael's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his pen to write. When he finally put words to paper, the letter he sent Renee wasn't angry. It was pleading. He asked her directly if something was going on. 2 weeks later, her reply came. It was short, cold, and it ended with a sentence that sliced through him like a blade. "I didn't plan for this to happen, but yes, I've been seeing him." Michael read that line over and over until the paper crumpled in his fists. There, in the cramped silence of his cell, he felt something break inside him. Betrayal has a way of making time stop. Every memory of her, every laugh, every promise, every visit, now felt poisoned. And the worst part was knowing that the man she'd chosen over him was someone who knew exactly what that betrayal would mean. In Michael's mind, this wasn't just infidelity. It was a personal humiliation. a wound he couldn't ignore. And in the shadows of his thoughts, something darker began to take shape, an idea he would never be able to take back. For days, Michael barely spoke to anyone. In prison, silence can be a survival tactic, but this wasn't strategy. This was the kind of quiet that comes when a man is unraveling inside. He stopped showing up to the yard. He skipped meals. His cellmate said he'd wake in the middle of the night to find Michael sitting on the edge of his bunk, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he was trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. He replayed every moment in his head, introducing Daryl to Renee during that first prison visit, telling her he was a good guy, trusting Daryl enough to share food and stories behind those walls. He thought about the times he'd bragged to Daryl about Renee's loyalty, how she'd never given him a reason to doubt her. Now, all of that felt like a setup, like Daryl had been waiting for this chance all along. The more Michael thought about it, the more the humiliation burned. It wasn't just that his wife had been unfaithful, she had been unfaithful with him. A man who knew exactly what that would do to Michael's pride, his reputation, even his sense of identity. In prison, news spreads fast. It wasn't long before other inmates started dropping hints, offhand comments about how women get lonely, or how friends can't always be trusted. Michael didn't respond, but inside, each remark was like pouring gasoline on a fire. By the second week, his grief had hardened into something else, something sharper. He stopped thinking about why it happened and started thinking about what he would do when he saw her next. The next visit was already scheduled. Renee had booked it before she sent that confession letter, maybe thinking they could talk it out face to face. For Michael, that visit became a countdown. He began to rehearse what he would say. At first, it was about confronting her, demanding answers. But as the days went on, those imagined conversations grew shorter and darker. Words didn't feel like enough anymore. Michael wasn't the kind of man to cry in public, but the night before the visit, alone in his cell, he broke. The sound was low, ragged, almost like he was choking on the weight of everything he'd lost. When it passed, he wiped his face with the back of his hand and sat in silence. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, the decision was made. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even spoken. It just settled in him, heavy and certain. When Renee walked into that visiting room, she would see the man she'd betrayed, but she wouldn't walk out again. The morning of the visit began like any other inside. The clang of metal doors, the bark of orders from guards, the shuffle of boots on concrete. But for Michael, every sound felt muted, distant. His mind wasn't on the routine. It was on the clock. He shaved with slow, deliberate strokes, studying his own reflection in the small, scratched metal mirror bolted to the wall. His eyes looked different, colder. There was no nervousness now, only a strange calm that comes when a man has convinced himself there's no turning back. When his name was called for visiting, he moved without hesitation. The guards checked him over, pat down, metal detector, the same as always. He barely noticed. As they escorted him toward the visiting room, he thought about the first time Renee had come to see him all those years ago. She'd smiled so wide, her eyes full of hope. He remembered holding her hand across the table, promising her that they'd get through it together. Now those memories felt like a cruel joke. Renee arrived late that day. Through the glass doors, Michael saw her walking in, dressed neatly in a pale blouse and jeans. Her hair was done the way he used to like it, though now it felt like a stranger's choice. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence he'd fallen for, and that only made the bitterness rise sharper in his chest. When she sat down across from him, she gave a small, almost hesitant smile. "Hi," she said softly, as if they were still the couple who once counted days until they could see each other again. Michael studied her face, saying nothing at first. He noticed the faint scent of perfume, the kind she used to wear on special occasions. But in his mind, it wasn't for him. The first few minutes passed in strained small talk. She asked how he'd been. He asked about her job. But beneath every word, there was an unspoken truth pressing down on both of them. Then, halfway through the visit, Michael leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "So," he said quietly. "How's Daryl?" Renee froze. Her hands resting on the table pulled back slightly. She tried to laugh, to brush it off, but the sound rang hollow. "Michael, we're not here to talk about that." But Michael wasn't smiling. He kept his gaze steady, watching every flicker of emotion cross her face. Guilt, defensiveness, fear. In that moment, the room around them seemed to fade. The noise of other conversations, the footsteps of guards, even the cold hum of the fluorescent lights. It all disappeared. It was just the two of them, locked in a silence that felt like the seconds before a storm breaks. Michael's jaw tightened. He had waited for this moment, replayed it in his mind for weeks, and now every part of him was bracing for the final push that would tip him over the edge. Renee shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward the clock on the wall, then to the guards at the far end of the room. Michael noticed, and it only fueled the fire burning inside him. "You think I don't know?" he said, his voice low but steady. "You think I don't hear things in here? That I don't have people who see?" "Michael, please," she began, but he cut her off. 6 years, Renee. 6 years I've been in here, holding on to you, holding on to us, and the one person you find comfort in is him." Her lips trembled, but she didn't deny it. The silence between them was louder than any words could have been. Michael leaned closer, his hands flat on the table, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what that does to a man? To sit in a cell every night picturing his wife with someone who used to share his meals, his stories, his life?" Renee's eyes filled, but she looked away. "I didn't plan for this, Michael. I was lonely. Lonely?" His voice sharpened, the word cutting through the air. "And he was just there to fill the space, right? My friend, my brother in here. You think that's something I can just get over?" She reached out then, maybe to take his hand, maybe to calm him, but he didn't move toward her. He stared down at her fingers, at the small ring he'd saved for months to buy her before his arrest. The tension in the room was thick enough that a nearby couple had gone quiet, sensing the shift. One of the guards glanced in their direction, but Michael's voice was still controlled. His anger kept just below the surface. "Tell me," he said, his tone almost calm now, which somehow felt more dangerous. "When you're with him, do you think about me?" Renee flinched, her face flushing with a mix of shame and frustration. "I don't want to do this here." Michael leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. In his chest, his heart was pounding so hard it hurt. He had thought that hearing the truth would break him. Instead, it solidified something cold and unshakable. She wasn't going to stop seeing Daryl. She wasn't going to give him the closure he wanted. And in that moment he knew, if she walked out of this room, she would walk straight back to him. And Michael couldn't let that happen. Michael's breathing slowed, but his stare stayed fixed on Renee. From the outside, it might have looked like he was calming down, but inside, something had already snapped. He reached beneath the table where his hands had been resting. The guards had done their searches, but Michael had spent weeks preparing for this. Hidden in the lining of his prison-issued pants was a piece of sharpened plastic, the kind of makeshift weapon inmates called a shank. It wasn't much, just a melted-down utensil filed to a point. But in close quarters it was enough. Renee was still talking, her voice low and pleading. "Michael, please. Let's just talk about this when you've had time to think." But Michael wasn't listening anymore. His chair scraped hard against the floor as he stood, the sudden movement drawing the eyes of nearby visitors. Before Renee could push her chair back, his hand came down hard on the table, then forward, the shank in his grip flashing once under the harsh fluorescent light. Gasps cut through the room. A child cried out from across the floor. Renee's eyes went wide, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips before the first blow landed. Michael's movements were fast, fueled by months of betrayal and the raw, unfiltered rage of the moment. Guards shouted, chairs toppled. The room erupted into chaos as families rushed toward the walls, shielding children from the sight. Michael barely heard any of it. In those few seconds there was nothing but him, her, and the betrayal that had brought them here. 2 guards slammed into him from behind, dragging him down. The shank clattered to the floor, skidding under the table. Renee was slumped forward, her hands clutching at her side, her breaths shallow and uneven. They pulled Michael back, forcing his arms behind him, the cuffs biting into his wrists. Even as they hauled him toward the exit, his eyes stayed locked on Renee. Not with remorse, but with the hollow, vacant expression of a man who had done exactly what he came to do. The visiting room was in shambles. The vending machine area was littered with spilled snacks. A purse lay on the floor, its contents scattered. And in the middle of it all, Renee's chair sat empty. The scene burned into the memory of everyone who had been there that day. The moment the visiting room doors slammed shut behind Michael, the noise outside exploded. Guards were shouting into radios, ordering the lockdown of the entire facility. The metallic clang of gates echoed through the corridors as every inmate was ordered back to their cells. Michael was shoved into a holding area, his hands still cuffed tightly behind his back. 2 officers stood guard, their faces tense. One of them muttered, "You just bought yourself the rest of your life in here." Michael didn't respond. His breathing was steady, almost unnervingly calm. Meanwhile, back in the visiting room, medics were working frantically over Renee. They called out vitals, their voices sharp and urgent, while the rest of the visitors were quickly escorted out. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others whispered to each other, already piecing together the story they'd tell once they were outside. In the warden's office, security footage was pulled up within minutes. The black and white images showed the tense conversation, the moment Michael stood, the glint of the weapon, and the chaos that followed. There was no mystery here. The act had been witnessed by more than 20 people, and the cameras had captured every second. The investigators arrived fast. 2 detectives, both familiar with the prison, walked into the holding area where Michael sat. They asked the obvious question. Why? Michael's eyes lifted slowly to meet theirs. "She betrayed me," he said simply. "With him." They pressed him for details, names, the timeline of events. Michael gave them enough to confirm what they'd already begun to suspect, that Daryl, the former inmate, was at the center of it. One detective made a note to track him down immediately. Outside the prison walls, word was already spreading. By the time evening news aired, the headline was everywhere. Inmate attacks wife during prison visit. Love triangle turns deadly. Inside, tension rippled through the cell blocks. Some inmates saw Michael as a man who'd defended his pride. Others thought he'd lost everything over a woman who was never going to wait for him. Either way, his name was on everyone's lips. The official report would take weeks to finalize, but the conclusion was already clear. Michael wasn't going back to his regular cell. His life inside had changed forever. And the woman at the center of it all, her life would never be the same again, if she even survived the night. Renee was rushed to the nearest hospital under police escort. Surgeons worked through the night, but the injuries were too severe. By sunrise, the news reached the prison. She hadn't made it. When the warden came to tell Michael, there was no outburst, no tears. He simply nodded once and stared straight ahead, as if the words had only confirmed what he already knew would happen. In his mind, the story had ended in the visiting room the moment he stood up. For the prison administration, the incident became a nightmare of paperwork, investigations, and tightened security measures. The visiting rules were rewritten. Staff received new training on spotting signs of escalating tension. But for the people who were there that day, the guards, the visitors, even the inmates who heard the commotion through the walls, it became a memory that would never fade. Daryl was questioned by police within days. He denied everything at first, but the letters found in Renee's home told a different story. Though he wasn't charged in connection to her death, the public scorn followed him. His name was now tied to one of the most infamous prison incidents in recent memory. As for Michael, he was moved to a maximum security facility, placed in isolation. The new charges ensured he would never breathe free air again. The silence of his new cell was absolute. No voices from the yard, no hum of distant conversation, just the echo of his own thoughts. Some say they saw a change in him after that, a hollowing out, as if whatever humanity he had left had burned away with Renee's last breath. Others believed he felt no regret, that in his mind, justice had been served. This case is a chilling reminder of how betrayal, pride, and a single moment of rage can destroy more than just relationships. They can end lives and rewrite futures forever. If you've stayed with me through this story, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I read every one, and I'm always curious to see how far these stories reach. And if you want more true crime stories that pull you in from the first second and keep you there until the very end, make sure you subscribe now, because the next case might just be even more shocking.